that it is impossible within an hour or an hour and a half to cover such a vast field. But what I shall be doing, I shall deal with the beginnings of man and the African contribution to that. And I shall go on to deal with what has become absolutely critical in the reassessment of African man. Most of us are aware and most of us are given credit for our great music, our great contributions to sports, etc., which is good. But few of us are given credit for tremendous intellectual and scientific contributions. And I want you to become particularly aware of these contributions, because Europe, so-called Western civilization, owes a great deal to many of these contributions. And I want to begin, therefore, by talking about the origins of man and to go on to deal with sciences in inner Africa before the Holocaust, before the slave trade, and to touch also on the African element in Egyptian civilization, which is greatly misunderstood, and its profound impact on Europe through Greece, and finally to deal with the impact of the Moors and the African element among the Moors and the impact of the Moors on the sciences of Europe on the edge of the Renaissance and the Industrial Revolution. Now, it has long been understood and accepted that man was born in Africa. That has never been in great dispute, in fact, over the last 20 to 25 years. What has been in dispute as to whether it mattered. Because when I was going to university in England, it was said, yes, man is born in Africa, but he came to Europe in a very low-level stage, not complete man. And then he evolved to proper man in Europe, and then complete proper man in Europe and Asia, then went back into Africa to help his benighted brothers. So the fact that man was born in Africa was not used in our favor. What has been discovered within the last 5 years is that not only was the first man born in Africa, but the last man. In other words, it is not a question of who started the human race, because the first human being is not complete, is not very advanced. There are 6 sequences before we come to final man. Neanderthal man, for example, is also African. He enters Europe, he enters Asia, but he has a lobe in the brain missing. He's not complete. What we have discovered in the last 5 years is the last man, modern man, is African. That about 140,000 years ago, and we're not pretty sure of the exact date, scientists are working on the possibility that it's between 140,000 to 200,000, but they are almost unanimously agreed now that the last man, the fully evolved modern man that peoples this planet, is African man. He has an African brain. And that he moved into Europe, he spread across Africa, he moved into Europe, he moved into Asia, he displaced earlier types in the sequence of man, and that type, that final modern man, is caught in the ice in Europe in a period known as the worm interstadium, and about 55,000 years ago, changes begin to take place. These changes are superficial changes. They do not involve any new evolutionary phase, they involve mutations. In other words, the African is capable of producing all the races in the world, since it is through him other races spring. You have the albino type, for example, where in the ice you have the dropping of melanin, or the inactivity of the melanocytes, the dropping of pigmentation, because it becomes a disadvantage in certain extreme ice conditions, not temperate zones where we're living now. It becomes a disadvantage because in the tropic and subtropical regions where man was born, he had to have melanin shield in order to protect him from the intense ultraviolet radiation. In the ice, where light was tangential, it was an advantage for the sun to go right through the skin without the melanin shield. Hence the albino type began to have a survival capacity over the darker type in the ice, and then you have a stabilization of that type, which is still Africoid in feature, But the first change is melanin change, which produces changes in color of skin and color of hair, color of eyes, etc. You then have superficial morphological change, which affects the structure of the face, like the narrowing of the nose. The narrow nose is more effective in warming cold air. So that you have other things that follow this, contractions, like the mouth, the nose, etc. You have a broader type of face among the so-called sun people, and a narrower type of face or narrow features among the so-called ice people. European man, that is the Caucasoid type, does not emerge until about 55,000 years ago. Okay, so though you have about 5 million years of evolution of man, you do not get the final modern man in Africa until about 140 to 200,000 years ago, and then you have European man appearing, Caucasoid man appearing in Europe about 55,000 years ago. And then you have in Asia a complicated situation, because you have both the Africoid Asiatic, there are about 100 million black people in Asia today, and you also have the invasion of Europeans, or the Aryan type, in India, so you get an Indo-Aryan type as well, with more European type features but with darker skin. So that you have explanations emerging now for the differences between races, which are superficial. The differences between races today, particularly in America, do not remain superficial simply because of the fact that slavery and the denial of status to black people and the denial of their humanities created an entirely new situation. That is the reason why it has become necessary to make distinctions, and it has become necessary to discuss the contributions of the African type as distinct from that of the Caucasoid type, because every attempt has been made over the last few hundred years to deny us any significant role in history. We have been completely wiped out of history. Wherever we appear only as slaves, servants, little people. And in fact, all studies of Africa until recently, 95% of the studies in Africa are of little people. I know from my own life, you cannot go anywhere in a territory and study its people. You have got, if you want to have a sense of the complexity of a civilization, you have to go to the centers as well as the periphery. And if you smash the centers, you have no idea, until archaeology recovers what lay at the center, you have no idea of what people were doing. I have lived everywhere in the world except Asia. Lived, not passed through. I spent 10.5 years in Europe. I spent 24 years in South America. I spent 1 year in Africa. I spent 20 years here in the United States. I have lived in parts of Europe where many Western Europeans have never strayed. I spent 1 year behind the Iron Curtain. I speak Hungarian. I speak Swahili. I used to speak French. And of course I speak English very well. I went into parts of Europe there they have never seen a black man in all history except on television. I found in one village where I went into Eastern Europe, because we seem to think Europe is all one great industrialized world. I went into parts, villages in Europe, where I found as many as 12 Europeans using one outhouse latrine. They did not have flush toilets. They knew of them because it was in their cities, but they did not have it. They went to the standpipe in the morning and they fetched water in buckets, just as some third world people do in their shattered condition. And they brought these buckets and they bathed. They didn't have showers. This is Europe, 20th century. Now suppose I was to write a book about the little European, the European away from the mainstream. Suppose I ignored all the technical achievements and advances Western Europe had made, feeding as it did upon the wealth of Africa and America. What would you think of Europe? That constituted the potential and capacity of the European. We have been made to look at Africa. It is only within the last 20 years that we have begun to discover that Africa had more complex technologies than we were led to believe. Why didn't we find them before? Why only within the last 20 to 25 years have we found such technologies? Because we were not looking at in the right place. We have dismissed the African. We were willing to assume that only those little irrelevant, peripheral, non-mainstream people constituted the totality of African genius. In 1978, two of our scientists, Peter Schmidt and Donald Avery, discovered Africans were smelting steel 1,500 years ago in Tanzania, East Africa, along the lakes of Tanzania and Uganda. Peter Schmidt and Donald Avery of Brown University discovered this. Now other people were smelting steel too, but what was unusual here is that the Africans were smelting steel in quantity. What was unusual here is that when they studied their middens, they discovered that there were greater densities of population in these areas than there was in parts of Tanzania today. Few of you are aware of what happened to Africa. You know what happened to us, the transplanted African. We are aware of the horror of slavery. We are aware of the shattering of our families. But do you know what happened to Africa? Africa is a far cry from what it used to be and what it could be. Thank God it is in this century that the clock has begun to turn. Thank God that men like Mandela are free, because it is possible now to make a genuine fundamental change that may bring us into a totally different world in the 21st century. Let me make it clear to you that the tragedy that struck Africa was like the dropping of a dozen hydrogen bombs. Empires disintegrated. You cannot enter a continent and take millions of people, the young people, out of the heart of that continent and throw them across the ocean and expect to have a sane world. Africa was recut, its boundaries were recut, even people who were close together became enemies. The shock was cataclysmic, and it profoundly affected, it altered the burgeoning technologies of Africa. Look at the steel machine. When we found the steel machine, they discovered that Africans were producing steel at temperatures of 1,850 degrees centigrade. That is 200 degrees higher than any machine on earth until the 19th century. This they were doing in the 5th century. They discovered that Africans were not only producing at these high temperatures, they were producing steel in a single stage process. To do this, it called for iron crystallization, which involves a semiconductor technology unknown in the world until the late 19th, early 20th century. They were doing it in the 5th. Even when the great German scientist George Wilhelm Siemens discovered the process for mass producing steel in the middle of the 19th century, the Europeans produced steel in two crude processes. First, the sintering of solid particles, and then the final stage. The Africans were doing it in a single stage. And then came another shock. That not only were the Africans producing this long before Europe, at higher temperatures and in a single stage complex semiconductor type process, but they were doing it using less fuel. They were using less fuel because they had less fuel in Tanzania and Uganda at their disposal than we had formerly believed. We had assumed, because of the little books that were written about African primitives, we had assumed Africa was a vast jungle. Africa, according to United Nations report, Africa has less jungle than any other continent comparable with its land space. Let me explain that. Europe, you can take 2 Europes and put it in Africa, taking out Soviet, Asia. There is more woodland and forest in those two Europe, the comparable land space, than there is in Africa. Africa has less jungle than South America, where I come from. I was born in Georgetown, in South America, in Guyana. Georgetown is a sophisticated little wooden city, but most of my population live on the edge of the Atlantic in the coastland cities and towns and villages. But when I was an infant, my father was sent into the jungle. The British put him in charge of all road and river transport in that jungle. So I grew up in a jungle. I did not come out of that jungle until I was 14 years old. There is no modern African of consequence who spent more time in deep jungle than I have. And I'm not talking about woodland and forest. I'm talking about the jungles you see in Raiders of the Lost Ark. And the one thing that made it clear, was made very clear to me for the rest of my life, that you could not study that jungle village and get an idea of what was happening in Guyana. You could not study that jungle village and have some idea of what was happening in South America. You cannot just go anywhere, study any people in a country and say, this is it. Therefore, all these books that have been written upon the African have not caught the quintessence of the African. Why didn't they find the steel machines? The British were there long before Peter Smith and Don and Avery, but the British wrote down in their scientific journals that the Africans had only achieved 1,250 degrees centigrade. How did they get that figure? Because it's the lowest figure at which you can smelt iron, and since they couldn't deny they were smelting iron, that was their figure because they're the lowest people in the world. It's as scientific as that. Just 2 months after Schmidt and Avery discovered this, Lynch and Robbins of Michigan State University discovered Africans had built an astronomical observatory in Kenya 300 years before Christ. They found about 17 alignment points at this observatory. The Africans had made alignment points to certain stars and constellations, Side and Bellatrix and Orion and Aldebaran, and a range of other stars and constellations, and on the basis of these alignments they had built one of the most accurate of prehistoric calendars. It was not their first. The calendar we are using today with 2 variations is the African 365.25-day calendar. Did not come out of Europe. Even the Sumerians did not have a 365.25-day calendar. They had a 364 and 365 day, and the Greeks did not have a proper calendar at all. It was not affected by stars. It was sometimes affected by politicians. It was as chaotic as that. But even more astonishing in terms of the African contribution to astronomy was our discovery through the French, Marcel Briol and Germain d'Italin, who discovered the Dogon people of West Africa. They found them 200 miles from the city of the medieval university city of Timbuktu, which by the way is not a myth. I've been informed by UNESCO officials that far under the ground in dry earth they have found some manuscripts which they thought were lost forever. We have not found everything, but we have found some of them. They're still being examined. And these Dogon people were found in an inhospitable mountainous region. They had fled into this region when they heard stories of how these strange, pale-skinned men, these alien figures had entered, and they were taking people up and throwing them into the ocean. Many people were disappearing in these boats, so they ran into this area. When they were studied, we were astonished by the sophistication of their knowledge. Those of you who want to follow this, there are 3 books on it. 2 of them have been translated into English so far. One of them is called Conversations with Ogoto Meli, the Dogon Elder. The other one is called The Pale Fox. These African people had started a dance to a star, the dance of orbits. A star which they call Siggy Polo, which we call Sirius B. It's a companion to the brightest star in the night sky, Sirius A. This star, Sirius B, is impossible to see with the naked eye. Let me repeat that. It is impossible to see with the naked human eye. The Africans not only saw it, they plotted its orbit right up to the year 1990. They did this 500 years ago. They showed it had a 50-year elliptical orbit around its parent star, Sirius A, and an orbit of 1 year on its own axis. We have established through modern science that it has a 50-year elliptical orbit. Perhaps next year, using our Hubble telescope, we will find out if it has a 1-year orbit on its own axis. They went further. They said it was made of a bright metallic iron, and that although it was an imploded star and seemed smaller than all the big bright stars around it, it was so heavy that if all the creatures on this earth were one lifting mechanism, they could not budge it. We have since discovered through modern science that it is the heaviest type of star in our galaxy. They went further. They said there was something flashing and darkening, contracting and expanding within the region of this star. 3 years ago, the Einstein orbiting satellite sent out from NASA found the Africans were dead correct. There is such an object. It's a dwarf nova. How did they do it? These are supposed to be primitives. Kenneth Brecher, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, wrote in Technology Review, the Africans have no business knowing any of this. And true. The African we know, the African we've been made to see in books is a simple, nice fellow living on the edge of civilization, and we praise him for his humanity because we do know, and this is a fact, civilization is not just machines. Civilization is the humanization of the human. And therefore, there is good in saying that simple people, because they're not capable of the wickedness of more advanced people, that's good. But we're not just simple people. Because that kind of astronomy indicated they were involved in complex things. The Russians, I had communication with them some years ago because the New York Times, I brought out an essay in the New York Times on its op-ed page on December the 4th, 1975, Archaeology's discovery of an African presence in America, with the New York Times subtitled Bad News for Columbus. That article went all over the world, and then I got a letter from academician Sanarov of a Russian science city in Asia. They said that they'd been working for some time on Pacific migrations, not just the Bering Strait migrations of the Native Americans who came across the Bering Straits, but also migrations from Japan in pre-Columbian times, which I mentioned in my book, is the finds Jomon pottery in Ecuador. In fact, the Japanese were the first people to offer to translate my book into Japanese, though my publisher rejected that without even informing me. But nevertheless, they wanted to know more about these Atlantic migrations since they had concentrated on Pacific migrations. They did not do this out of prejudice. They did this because they had no real contact with Africa in earlier times, and that they were interested, they wanted to know more about this. So a correspondence began, and they eventually informed me, because I was very curious as to what they'd found in Egypt, because they spent a lot of time in Egypt before eventually they were kicked out. And they told me that one of their scientists, Bolosimo, had discovered perfectly ground spherical crystal lenses in ancient Africa, leading them to the conclusion that some Africans had telescopes. The Egyptians, Galileo had told us that there were telescopes in ancient Egypt. In fact, Galileo used an African water clock in one of his experiments in accelerated motion. And it is possible, since the Dogon kept up a linkage with the Egyptians even after the fall of ancient Egypt, that they could have got telescopes in there, but they could have got it through their own work, though it may have disappeared over time. But we cannot explain away these things because they do indicate sophistication in technology which we are not aware of, because we are finding these things in shattered worlds. The Dogon preserved their shattered world because they fled and thereby protected themselves by going into an inhospitable mountainous region, protected themselves from the European invaders. Mathematical systems, we did not know those existed in Africa. Why? Because we went into the bush. We were interested in finger counting. It looks so exotic. It makes good television. Then Claudia Zaslavsky spent a great part of her life studying what Africans were doing in mathematics. She discovered a range of mathematical systems. She even found some African people like the Shona, the children of the Shona. Almost all their games are mathematical games. She found a range of geometric designs, complex geometrical designs among the Dogon. She found the Yoruba, who had traded for centuries before Europe, who had traded, involved in intensive and extensive trading, had developed an intricate vigesimal number system, and that the ordinary Yoruba market women were working in this. And I remember her telling me how a Yoruba mathematician said to her, "How come? I am Yoruba and I'm a mathematician. And I did not know of this until you pointed it out to me." And Claudia said quite rightly, though rather sharply, "It's because your brain was manufactured in Europe." Very important to know that being African does not make you know anything about Africa. Most Africans know nothing about this. It is only within the last year or two that secret copies of the Journal of African Civilizations are finding themselves in many places. I was starting to find how many South Africans knew about the journal because tapes had been smuggled into South Africa. So that you have to become aware that we are at the cutting edge of a whole new movement. While we must feel great anger at what has happened in the past, let us not give up hope, because something is beginning to turn in the world. And while it seems turbulent and confused, possibilities occur when cracks occur in rigid systems. There are brave cracks in this system. Cracks so large you could walk through. Do not forget that. When I was a boy, I was told the sun will never set upon the British Empire. I knew nothing about Africa or Africans. We were taught to hate ourselves. I hated the fact that I had African blood because there was nothing to show me that Africans had done anything. There were no books in Africa. The only books we had in Africa was Tarzan. And Tarzan was always this beautiful, great white Tarmangani. He was always saving my brothers from the beasts of the jungle. He knew more about them than the guys who were living there for thousands of years. He talked with them. They brought him up. So without the white ape man, we couldn't survive. That's what Tarzan taught me. So it is only through grave, cruel, slow processes that one began to realize that one civilization was alive. That one had been murdered inside, that one's spirit had been murdered, that one's pride had been murdered, that one's conception of oneself had been destroyed. I felt proud on Empire Day. I was so glad. We were given a penny and a mauby and a bun. And we said, how marvelous is the British King and Queen to give us a penny, a mauby and a bun. We did not know how much we had given up for that mauby, penny and bun. So that was my world. And I believed, as many of us believed, that the sun would never set in the British Empire. By the time I became a man, it had not only set but gone down. This is the century, therefore, in which we have to find hope again. While we must be filled with anger by the horrors of the Holocaust, never let us lose faith Never let our children lose faith that we can change the world, because that's the only thing that we know for certain in the universe. It never remains the same. Not only do worlds change, stars change, planets change, man also changes. And therefore we have got to become aware of this history, because it has the capacity to change us. We are the inheritors of a certain consciousness. That consciousness is clouded and overwhelmed by certain myths. As we begin to become aware of new truths, a certain mist falls away from us. It becomes possible to act again, to resense oneself again, to feel again, to act again, to speak again in a new way. And therefore this history is not just throwing sensational facts around. They are seeds that can germinate and create the flowering of a new spirit, a new man. When we look at Africa, when I was in university in London, I was so proud to go to university. It was impossible to go to university. There was no university in my country. When I was 16 years old, the highest you could go was high school. There was no college. I finished my exams. I had to sit all the exams over again at 17 to get 10 more marks, because only the person who came first for the whole country could go to university. So you had to get the highest marks in the country to enter university. You had to be the brightest person for that year. So I did my exams all over again at 18 for the third time to get 10 more marks. But I couldn't do it, because only the scientists, people who took the precise sciences like mathematics and chemistry and physics, they got the scholarship. So I stayed at home. It took me 10 years before I got into university. I got into university at 28. I got my first degree BA at 32. I hear people around here in their early 20s talking about their life is finished. What absurdity. So there was I. And I was particularly chosen because I had written a special series of things in the Caribbean novel. I was not in this. I was writing novels. I was studying literature. And the thing that attracted me to Africa was the sophistication of its literature, not anthropology. I never entered anthropology initially. It was literature. And because of what work I had done in literature, I was given a scholarship and I sent to the best school for African studies, so they said. School of Oriental and African Studies, London. The only school at that time that was supposed to have more professors than students. I don't know if it is true, that was a rumor going around. And I had the best professors in Swahili. But after 2 years, I realized that my anthropology degree was making me more ashamed of Africa than proud, because anthropology at that time was distinguished from sociology. Sociology was supposed to be the study of advanced industrial people. Anthropology was the study of simple people, simple society. So professors I had great admiration for. I thought they were world authorities. And then you find their world authorities, yes, but world authorities and wooga-boogas and looga-boogas. They would go out into the bush, find the simplest, smallest tribe, where they could control all the variables and vectors, and they study them to death and they come back. That's why they found no technology. That's why they found no writing. That's why they found no mathematics. That's why they found no metallurgy. That's why they found no remarkable plant life or medicine. They could dismiss us all, because they were always looking at the periphery. We were always, when we look at Europe, we look at its great civilizations, Greece and Rome and the British Empire, and all the great achievements of its great geniuses. But when we look at Africa, we always look at the naked African, the hungry African, the diseased African, the shattered African, the battered African, the oppressed African. How, therefore, can you have a sense of equality? Where you see the best of the white man and the worst of the black man. That is why we found nothing, because we were not even bothering to look. I was told that Africans never read nor wrote. They're pre-literate. That's what my professor told me. Africans are pre-literate before the age of writing. I did not know then that many Europeans were pre-literate, if that term was used. The English, look at this book, Egypt Revisited. Look what is written in. Those are songs. Anglo-Saxon songs, perhaps. Egyptos, Greek. But these are just songs. There is no script. There is no English script. English does not have a script. This is Roman. The Spanish have no script. Roman. The Germans have no script. Roman. The French have no script. Roman. One European tribe conquered others and gave them writing. When the Romans conquered Britain, the Romans were starting to find that the Anglo-Saxons never read nor wrote. They didn't have books. They didn't have script. They talked. Everybody talks. They didn't write anything down. And I remember as a boy, I read the Roman and Greek classics because my father had come third in the British world in Greek, and he had all the Greek and Roman classics. And at that time I thought that there were only three civilizations in the world, the Roman, the Greek, and the British. And I read when Cicero said, when they had beaten the English down, he said, these people are so ignorant, I am not even sure we can turn them into good slaves. So what are the scripts that Europe has? Europe has Greek script, it has Roman script, there's the Cyrillic alphabet in Russia, there's the Phoenician script, which is half and half, greatly influenced by the Egyptian. There's the Celtic script, which according to the Book of Ballymote is not entirely European. Does Africa have less? Africa has the Mande script. You can go back to Moorish 3,200 years before Christ and see the script, writings, inscriptions on the Sahara walls. You see it surviving in the modern variant, the Vai. Africa has the Akan script, both a drum script and a written script. It has about 145 symbols. Nyangora Bua of the Ivorian coast has shown us this script. He's written a whole book about that script. Europeans didn't know it was a script. They thought it was just gold weights because that's what they were interested in. There's the Faka script, the only script that travels from Africa to America. It's used in Suriname. We found Africans writing to their girlfriends in the Faka script. When Africans were brought out of Africa, they were usually split up. If they spoke the same language, they were separated. But they made the mistake in Suriname. They were in such a hurry to get labor that they took large sections of a tribe and brought them over. And they brought their script, which still survives, the Faka script. And there's the Meroitic script at UNESCO. We have discovered more than 800 books written by Africans before Christ. At least 600 years before Christ, it's in Meroitic. My good friend and colleague in Okanta spoke of him, Sheikh Anthony Diop, took us further than anyone else in the decipherment of the Meroitic script. His death is a great blow to us. It has thrown us back by at least 20 years. We are extremely fortunate, however, that we have a genius in Africa who may take his place, Theophilo Beng of the Congo, whose work appears in this book, Egypt Revisited, and who is a master of many languages. And then there's the hieroglyphic script. People argue that the hieroglyphic script only appeared in the north, in Egypt, because the blacks in the south, we'll come to that in a moment, the blacks in the south did not develop any script. Not true. In 1962, and I want you to note this because this is the most important single discovery in Africa in the last 300 years. In 1962, an American team under Keith Seal and Bruce Williams discovered a pharaonic dynasty known as Ta Seti in Nubia, Ethiopia. A dynasty began, which began at least 200 years before the first pharaoh appears in Egypt. Among the indisputably black people of the Sudan at a place called Qustul, Q-U-S-T-U-L, they found a pharaonic dynasty establishing clearly for the first time that the pharaonic empire, the pharaonic dynasty, the pharaonic culture was born not in Egypt but in Nubia. And there they found evidence of at least 12 black kings who reigned in Nubia at Qustul on the edge of the Sudan at least 200 years before Nama or Scorpion or Menes appears in Egypt. And there they found the palace facades and the palace erects. And there they found the costumes of the pharaohs, and there they found the falcon god Horus, part of the Trinity, Osiris, Isis, and Horus. And there they found on the black king's head the crown of the south, which was to join later the crown of the north. It has an unmistakable shape. And there they found the boat that takes the pharaohs to the underworld, all in the king's chambers. They came upon 33 large tombs. The Russians had just finished building the Aswan Dam for Egypt, and the waters were to flood over part of Nubia, and the great archaeological treasures would be lost forever. And teams rushed down from all over the world. The American team was extremely fortunate because they found an enormous cemetery which they call Cemetery L, and there they found 33 large tombs as large as that of the great northern kings of a later time, Ka and Nama at Abydos. And there they found thousands of stoneware vessels and pottery and ancient cloth and jewelry, and they brought them back to the United States, where for 16 years they painfully pieced it together until a picture began to appear, establishing very clearly that pharaonic dynasties, pharaonic empires, pharaonic culture was not born north in Egypt, it was born in Nubia, south of Egypt. This has been a great controversy. Within the last few months, I have been attacked viciously by the New York Times, the Washington Post, Biblical Archaeology, the Smithsonian, because of this book. This is no joke. The claim to Egypt is a very serious matter because it affects everything. Egypt has left a lasting impression on the world. The word Christ, K-R-S-T, is an Egyptian word. The word thought comes from the Egyptian god Thoth, the god of learning. The word Africa comes from the Egyptian word Afrika, which means beginnings. The word Re comes from the Egyptian Ra. There's a whole range of things. Those are just superficial little things. I shall go into it into greater depth. It had a profound effect upon the world. It still has. Do not for one moment believe that what happened 10,000 years ago is something we could forget, because according to Einstein, what happened 10,000 years ago and 10 minutes ago occupies the same space-time in consciousness. This is the universe. And our prejudices and our assumptions and our notions and our reflexes are determined by what we think happened in the past. And because our past has been manipulated, and because we have been made to think that the only figures who shone in the past were the figures of other races, and that we had no part in it. That is why so many of us have such low self-esteem. Half of the people who communicate with me, half the people who buy my journals are in prisons. They write to say how profoundly it affects their vision of life. Because in the darkness and emptiness and despair of those souls, this is like a light shining again in the world. We have got to look at our history almost as a religious force. When I was in Africa, The first week I cried like a child. I felt so alone and so lost. And then, after that, I felt almost like if I had an umbilical cord that stretched out from my body that I could put in a socket. I felt almost as if there was some peculiar ancient electricity that could enter my system and revitalize me, because I fell upon things which I was told did not exist. And I want you to bear that in mind. This is no mystical notion, it is real. Men are determined, the size and stature of man is determined by the size and stature of his consciousness. We have shrunk in the consciousness of the world. We have shrunk in our own consciousness. And if we are to rebuild it and make it a huge thing again, we have got to go back to our history. We have got to realize what happened in the world. And in Africa we were told there was no great medicine. That the Africans, whenever you see the African practicing medicine, they pick out of some stupid witch doctor. I'm not saying all the witch doctors are stupid, some of them are excellent doctors, but they always pick on the mumbo jumbo, and you get fine. It makes good television. You would think there is no scientific superstructure to African medicine. The Africans gave us urbane, the Africans gave us capsicum, the Africans gave us physostigmine, which is used in eye diseases. The Africans gave us Coca-Cola. The cola drink was used for thousands of years. Coca-Cola put the fizz in it. The Africans gave us Sertima, the first drug to treat hypertension and psychotic disorder. The Africans gave us carpectin, which we use for diarrhea today. And we have found vaccines in Africa long before Jenner invented the vaccine in Europe. Cotton Mather tells us that the slave Onesimus brought the smallpox vaccine to America. We found the Africans had come upon the vaccine by puncturing the skin for beautification and identification markings, and they soon learned that you could introduce a germ at a certain level in the body, and that it would build up an immunity against germ coming at a greater intensity. They had quarantines, they had sick bushes, they had autopsies. We have found all that. We found some delicate operations, which I will touch upon in a moment. We found tetracycline among the Africans. Do you know when we started to use tetracycline as an antibiotic? In the 1950s, we found tetracycline in the bones of ancient Africans in Nubia 14 centuries ago. We found they were using tetracycline as an antibiotic 1400 years ago. We found the yellow-green flash of tetracycline in the bones of these Africans, and where we found it, we found the lowest incidence of infectious disease in an ancient population. And then we found aspirin. We found the Bantu were using aspirin, they were using salix capensis, which is salicylic acid, the main active ingredient in aspirin. Long before us, they were using it for certain skeletal, muscular, neurological pains. They were using it long before us. And operations, we found the Africans were the first to initiate eye cataract surgery. We found it in Jenny, medieval Mali. We found the Africans had still solutions that could almost freeze the eyeball, and that they could take delicate instruments and knock the cataract off the eye. Nobody was performing eye cataract surgery in the 14th century. They were, the Arabs reported. In the middle of the 19th century, the cesarean section was an extremely complex operation. Almost invariably, women who had problems with their birth canal and had to have cesarean sections died in Europe. Then the British Empire, which had spread its tentacles over half the world, became aware of the fact that certain Africans were performing the cesarean with 100% success. A team under Dr. Felkin went out among the Banyoro surgeons in Africa and discovered the Africans were performing this operation with a skill that exceeded that of their best Harley Street specialists. They studied it very closely. They studied how the Africans collapsed the abdominal wall. They studied how they used the cautery iron, that they were able to stanch internal bleeding almost instantly with minor tissue damage. They studied how they stitched. They actually drew the stitches and brought it back. It was published in the Edinburgh Medical Journal at the close of the 1870s, after which the cesarean section became very successful in Europe. You've never heard of that. Plants. We have found plants in this country that we cannot explain. Long before the slave trade, botanists discovered there are two major cultivated cottons in America, Gossypium hirsutum and Gossypium barbadens. They're known as tetraploid cottons. When we took them in the lab, we found of 26 chromosomes, 13 are African and 13 are American. Botanists were amazed how could an African cultivated cotton, which is Gossypium herbaceum, intermarry with a wild American cotton in order to produce the two tetraploid cottons, Gossypium hirsutum and Gossypium barbadens. Do you know what they said? Perhaps it floated from Africa by itself. They actually built a tank. Professor Stevens built a tank to simulate the salination, that is the saltwater content and temperature of the Atlantic, to see if the cotton could float by itself. In the second week it sank. Wouldn't give up, you know. He said perhaps it will sink, but it will remain submerged under the current, clinging to driftwood and come to America. In the third week, it lost its potency, abandoned that experiment. Then came another brilliant botanist, Proctor, who said perhaps birds flew from Africa to America with the cotton. Birds, you know, not blacks. Blacks were seen and have been seen for the last few hundred years as static people who make no major advances unless somebody comes up with something and drags them along. So it was impossible to think that blacks could have cultivated or domesticated cotton. We have found now that the Africans domesticated cotton long before any other people, and that the Asiatic cotton, Gossypium arboreum, is a mutation of the African which entered Asia later. And we cannot explain away the intermarriage between the two cottons. In America, long before Columbus, thousands of years, not just before, at least 2,000 years before Columbus, according to what we found in the lab. It couldn't have come by itself. But I want you to be aware of how our conception of the African has become frozen. For years, I had a secret correspondence with the South African professor with Waterstrand University. I didn't tell him I was black. My name sounds Dutch, Van Sertima. It is a Dutch name. I'm the son of someone who was a slave of the Dutch called Van Sertima, the Dutch slave master called Van Sertima. So he thought I was Dutch, perhaps African. So we had a nice long correspondence. He had made an incredible discovery. He was a brilliant linguist, and he had discovered that maize, Zea maize, an American cotton, had traveled into Africa and crossed through parts of Africa, and he wondered how on earth could it have gotten into Africa. And then he began to pursue this, and then he found that African things had got into America. The colocasia, the yam, and one or two other things had got into America before Columbus. We had this correspondence going, and I was studying all of his linguistic evidence and exchanging information with him. And then suddenly one day, he wrote me and he said, Van Sertima, if you see the yam, the colocasia, and the Negro, listen to this. If you see the yam, the colocasia, and the Negro, all of three of which are West African trading items in America before Columbus, someone must have brought them there. In other words, although he had come to the conclusion that Africans were American before Columbus, he thought somebody, a human being, had brought these items, the Negro, there. Do you understand? Even when they make leaps, even when they make discoveries, they are fixed and locked in that racial stricture. And I found that this was something that was so crippling, that once one had racist ideas. It went beyond merely social relationships or economic relationships. It affected everything. It affected serious scientific objective inquiry. Now to come to deal with Egypt. I could say so much more about African science, but we have a limited amount of time. This has been the source of so much fighting. But let us look at the evidence. First of all, let us look at the culture. Because Jean Vercoute, when he appeared at UNESCO in 1974, and everybody was trying to knock Sheikh Anta Diop down, he jumped up and said, okay, it's proven that their writing was African, their culture was African, their way of thinking was African, their language is African, but still, Monsieur Diop is still not sure how many of them were Africans. Could you imagine that? The French have a European language. Their culture is European. Their writing is a Roman script European. We're not sure whether the French are European. That is the extraordinary situation. In 1974, a break occurred in this subject. For the first time, a world body invited Africans to talk about African history. African history had always been written by outsiders. They invited the wrong, right people. Sheikh Anta Diop of Senegal and Théophile Obiang of the Congo. Sheikh Anta Diop got up and spoke for 6 hours without drawing breath. He presented a vast amount of evidence, thousands of intimate interconnections between inner African languages and Egyptian language established through adjectives and verbs and suffixes and everything to establish beyond a shadow of a doubt that the Egyptian language was not Afro-Semitic or Afro-Hamitic or Afro-Nilotic or Afro-Asiatic, it was African. And UNESCO said, in spite of the passion and prejudice that marked that conference, there was one thing upon which at last they were unanimously decided, that the language of Egypt was an African language. And Sheikh Anta Diop showed that many of the Greek and Romans who had seen, they had entered, they were not guessing as we may guess now, they were there. They had attacked the people, invaded them, captured the place. And they said they were black-skinned with woolly hair. Herodotus makes it quite clear. These are black-skinned people with woolly hair. And Sheikh Anta Diop went to the Museum of Man in Paris and took square inches of skin off some of the mummies and put it to the melanin dosage test. Sheikh Anta was an extraordinary man. He wasn't just a linguist, an ethnologist, an Egyptologist. He was a physicist and a chemist. He worked in the most advanced lab in Europe under Frederick Julio Curie, who was related to the Curies who discovered radium, who got the Nobel Prize for the discovery of radium. Sheikh Anta Diop actually established the first radiocarbon lab in Africa. And Sheikh Anta Diop presented this evidence. I got a letter from a doctor who is a skeletal radiologist who told me that of 11 mummies they found in the Cairo Museum, 2 of the 11, this is just a small sample, 2 of them had triquetral fusion, that is fusion of the bones of the wrist. It only occurs in black people. When it occurs in a European, it's 1 in a billion. They found 2 in 11 and they said they were Caucasoid types. We look at the skeletons. William McIve of Oxford, Falkenberger did studies of skeletons where they shed the craniometric measurements, the structure of the skull and so forth, indicated that only 1/3 of the Egyptians, ancient Egyptians, were black. 11% were white. And the rest of them were brown Mediterranean peoples. Now, let's look at that closely. Chatterjee and Kumar did a study much later, and Sheikh Anta Diop showed the same thing, that if you were to take those craniometric measurements and put it in Africa, almost all the Africans would be brown Mediterraneans. Unless they found the classical Negroid type which they created in their mind. Everybody has to have a broad nose. Everybody has to have a certain prognatic jaw, and if you don't have heavy prognatism and very broad nose, you ain't black. Sheikh Anthony Up showed that there are variants of the black type, and these are not brown Mediterranean. Chatterjee and Kumar showed that when we look at pre-dynastic Nubia and Egypt, and we look at Middle Kingdom Egypt, we look at Old Kingdom Egypt, the craniometric measurements are roughly the same. Even though there are people trickling in from Europe and Asia, they have not profoundly affected the physical character of the ancient Egyptians. But let us look at their culture. That settles the matter. Their plant life is African. The bottle gourd, the cotton, the tamarind fruit, the oil palm fruit, the watermelon, a range of their plants, African. If the Mediterraneans were coming in, where are their plants? Let us look at their techno-complex. There's no mummies in the Mediterranean, but you can find mummies in Africa 500 years before we found the first Egyptian mummy. We have found mummies in inner Africa, mummified, flexed and buried, hands crossed, fingers open, just like in late Egypt. We have found the Pharaonic dynasty at Tasseti. We have found the language to be African. We have found the writing. We found hieroglyphs at Tasseti. Hieroglyphs! We have found the beginnings of the hieroglyphs south of Egypt before it appears in Egypt. We have found all their rituals to be African. Their circumcision is African. Their totemism is African. Their form of divine kingship is distinct from any divine kingship in Asia, and it does not exist in Europe. Now, how could the rituals of a people be African? Their techno-complex be African. Their plant life be African. Their language be African. Their writing be African, and they're not Africans in Africa. It's so ridiculous. And then the Egyptian delegate of all people, and the modern Egyptians, please note, because several of you are going on pilgrimages to Egypt and you're making big mistakes about certain things. The modern Egyptian is not necessarily native to place. Some of them are, many of them are not. They can claim the pyramids, they're later invaders. It's just like most of us in this room, white or black, we are not Native Americans. We are later Americans. Most of the Egyptians are later Egyptians. They're not native to place. Sadat was an exception. When Sadat was here, he said on CBS, they struck it off the air, I am a black man, and I'm the first true pharaoh in 2,000 years. No melodramatic statement, but he wanted to make a distinction. Yet when we put a black man to place Sadat, some of you remember, it was banned in Egypt. They don't want the black man playing Sadat. Now, I'm not attacking all modern Egyptians. I've had to work with them, but some of them are very, very prejudiced. They would not want to be associated in that way. They'll tell you things like, ancient Egyptian heritage is neither white nor black. Now, it is true, and let us say this if it needs to be said. To distinguish the world as a place of people of color and people without color, the colors of human beings are superficial things. They have become less so here in America because of savage, brutal things which have not passed. We have been separated in that way. It is not entirely our fault. But while that may be true, we have got to go back deliberately and consciously to pick out and select that which is African, because we're always put out into the cold. We're always told nonsense about how it only became so because everybody was mixed up in it. Like in biblical archaeology, we're being told about Egypt is multiracial. Egypt did become multiracial. We're not talking about the late period, when the trickling and invasions of people changed the racial and cultural character of the people. We're talking about the early period when the pyramids were built. We have found the evolution of the pyramid in inner Africa. We have found the mound with its little steps, and then developing interior rooms which become more complex before we see the final pyramid in Egypt. There are no pyramids in the Mediterranean. If these brown Mediterraneans created the pyramid, where are their pyramids? We have found no mummies in the Mediterranean. Where are their mummies? We have not found their plant life in the Mediterranean. Where are their plant life? So if they are the inspiration of ancient Egyptian civilization, how come it all comes out of Africa? It doesn't make sense. And why is it so important? Why is there such a fight? Do you know why? Because Egypt was to have the profoundest effect on Europe. When the Greeks invaded Egypt, all of their scholars went and sat at the foot of African teachers, even as I, out of my shattered world today, must go to Europe for my miseducation. Then did the Greeks go to Egypt for their education. Thales of Miletus, Democritus, Pythagoras, Eudoxus, Anaximander, Anaximenes, Heraclitus. There are so many of them. St. Clement of Alexandria tells us that if you were to write a book of 1,000 pages, you could not put down the names of all the Greeks who went to Africa to study. And even those who did not go claimed they went because it was prestigious. And those early Europeans did not develop any great prejudice against Africans. Let me tell you that. They revered blackness. They took Isis, the black goddess, the wife and sister of Osiris. She was worshipped throughout Europe. Paris is named after Isis. Paris, place of Isis, shrine of Isis. Europe comes from the African princess Europa. The Greeks made Artemis, a black woman, the goddess of chastity. They made Medea, who helped Jason win the golden fleece, a black woman. Circe, who helped Odysseus, who enchanted the crew of Odysseus, is a black woman with African features. You could see that in the book I edited, Black Women in Antiquity. Even Andromeda, who married Perseus, the Greek hero, is a black woman. Minerva, the goddess of wisdom, is a black woman. The first Europeans who saw the advances of the Africans were so startled that Alexander did not even build his capital in Europe. He built it in Africa, at Alexandria. And there they came. Pythagoras spent 20 years, according to Newton, spent 20 years. As much time as I have spent being educated here in the United States. 20 years with the Egyptians, and came back talking about the Pythagorean theorem. Newton tells us, Newton, the most remarkable of European scientists who had brought about the synthesis of the sciences, tells us that three things were prefigured by the Africans in Egypt. He said they had a certain sense of gravity, that they had a sense of the atom. They call it the monad, and although they had certain mystical notions about it, they recognized it as the building block of the physical universe. He said they were the first people to develop a heliocentric theory of the solar system. Europeans thought that the sun was the center. They thought that the earth was the center. It was the Egyptians who knew that the sun was the center. And there were so many other things. I cannot go on and on, but let me point to one thing before I leave Egypt, and I begin to conclude in talking about the Moors as I come to my conclusion. Let me point to the fact. Theophilo Benga in this book gives us a vision through text translated from the early Africans, a vision of God and of the universe, which is unique. Only among Africans does it appear. It does not appear in Europe. It does not appear in Asia. If Europeans or Asiatics created ancient Egypt, how come their vision of God and of the universe was different? These Egyptians believed, as many modern physicists believe, they come close to that conception, that there was a primal stuff in the universe. And through that primal stuff came a peculiar vibration, yerity as they call it. They call God the same thing that the Dogon call God. Some of the Bantu call God. The Egyptians have the same name. If it's Mediterranean, how come they do not have that name? And they believe that this primal stuff slowly grew to consciousness, and then there came this incredible consciousness of all things, God, who then reconstituted the primal stuff of the universe and set the present universe on its course. They believed of a universe before this universe. That's unique. It may not be true because no man will ever know what is the morning of time. We believe with this Hubble telescope we will come close to staring into the eye of God, the beginning of times. But whether we do or we do not, in terms of its modernity, in terms of its uniqueness, in terms of its complexity, only in Africa, among the Dogon, and among some of the Bantu, you can find parallels with this. So how could it, all of this, be African, and these people, the majority at least, are not African? But let me come to the last period, the Moors. After the greatness and glory of Greece and Rome had faded, Europe fell into a dark age. It went into decline. It went behind the great powers in Africa and Asia. And then came something worse than AIDS, the Black Death. The Black Death practically decimated Europe. In some places it killed 50% of the population. As we go out in the morning to empty garbage, in every European home, in some places, they had to empty a body every morning. And then came an invasion from outside. The Africans and the Arabs invaded Europe. They ran into Spain, they took it over. They ran into Portugal, they took it over. They took over Sicily. They got a small part of France right up to Tarascon. And they introduced something unusual into Europe and to a great part of Africa. They introduced 4 Muslim dynasties into Europe: the Umayyad dynasty, the Abbasid dynasty, the Almoravid dynasty, and the Almohade dynasty, the last 2 of which were formed on the Senegal River. And they went into Europe, and they brought so much. Europe had 2 universities. Europe was 99% illiterate, as was the rest of the world. Only a small group of people read and wrote. And they introduced 17 universities into Europe. Everything that could be translated in the known world and the past world. Out of Egypt, out of China, out of India, out of Persia, out of Arabia, out of Timbuktu and other places, centers of learning in Africa. It was all brought up, translated into Arabic, which, by the way, as a script, was created by a black African, Abul Aswan, according to the diaries of Ibn Khalikan. And this was brought up into Europe. They brought lemon into Europe for the first time. They brought strawberries for the first time. They brought ginger for the first time. They brought the cotton industry into Europe. They brought windmills for the first time into Europe. They brought crankshafts. They brought worm and pinion gears operated hydraulically. They brought new concepts in trigonometry. They brought algebra. They brought eyeglasses. The first people to cut eyeglasses in Europe were the Moors. They brought new concepts in agriculture. They brought lighting. There was not a single street, there was not a single city in Europe that was lighted. Not London, not Paris. But where the Moors were in Cordova, you could walk for miles by the flash of lamps. The finest silk in the world was produced in Murcia, where the Moors were. The finest blades in the world were cut at Toledo, where the Moors were. The finest sashes in the world were in Almeria, where the Moors were. The finest leather in the world was in Morocco, where the Moors were. The finest carpets were made in Tulala, where the Moors were. And they brought so much. They only insisted, it is true, that every people suffer from an invasion, but they did not take away the language of the Europeans. They did not take away their legal system. They did not take away their humanity. They did not totally take away their status. They merely insisted that they should have some say in the election of bishops, and since at that time the church was more powerful than the state in some places, it was a reasonable request. They brought public libraries into Europe. There was not a single public library in Europe, only private libraries owned by small groups who read and wrote. They introduced public baths into Europe. They introduced public markets into Europe. They introduced air conditioning into Europe. Air conditioning perfumed by flowers, mind you. They introduced hot and cold water systems into Europe, as in parts of North Africa. You could have ran water from the mountain in lead pipes into the cities. They introduced so many things. And as I told Congress, when Columbus sailed, the Latin sails on the ships of Columbus and Vespucci were Arab Latin sails which Arabs and Africans were using on the Indian Ocean. The Africans were not new to water. The longest trade, the longest sea traffic lanes in the world were the Niger and the Nile. They were not new to water, and it wasn't just inland streams. The Chinese report, according to Debunking, that Africans were bringing elephants to the court of China 2 centuries before Columbus. You can't take elephants to China in a dugout. And the compass was not developed in Europe. And the number system, let me close on this. The numbers we use today is not European. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, which the world uses to count. Europe did not have ciphers. This is how the Romans counted. 1 is 1, 2 is 1, 1, 3 is 1, 1, 1, 4 is 1, V. 5 is V. Then they start all over again. V1, V11, V111. You can't do higher mathematics in that. When Fibonacci in 1205 discovered the number system with ciphers in India, Europeans would not accept it. The church rule numbers are works of the devil. It is only because of the use of those ciphers by the Moors in the marketplaces of the world that ciphers were eventually adopted. They call it Arabic numerals, but we have found it came out from India. We do not know if the Indians got it from elsewhere. We can't swear about that. And the gun is not European. Gunpowder technology was taken out of China by the Moors, and the first evidence we have of the use of the gun is the Moors attacking India. Europeans took that and it became the source of great tragedy for other countries. So I want to say this. This was on the edge of the Renaissance, the edge of the Industrial Revolution, so that in the great sciences of the world do not for a moment believe that we were excluded, and do not for a moment believe that today we are totally out of it. I have been in Bell Labs, the largest research facility in the world, private research facility in the world. I've been at NASA. I'm one of the people who was sent to Kennedy Space Center to witness the blast off of the first black into space. I have met the black space scientists. One of them piloted a spaceship, Colonel Gregory. He also commanded the ship that took the most delicate reconnaissance satellite into space. I met people like Gillam IV, a black man who was in charge of our space program when we produced the shuttle. He saw it from babyhood to blast off the most advanced machine in the world. Our leading technical astronaut today is a black man. He is the man who redesigned the cockpit, the brain of the space shuttle, Colonel Gregory. We were responsible for major revolutions in the science of this country. Who revolutionized the food transport industry? A black man, Frederick Jones. Who revolutionized the whaling industry in the world? A black man, Lewis Temple. Who revolutionized the creation of the sugarcane industry? Who made sugar crystals for the first time? A black man, Norbert Ryu. Who revolutionized the shoe industry? Who created the first machine to mass produce shoes? A black man, Jan Manzanega. Who revolutionized the communications industry, the light guide, cables industry? who was the first man to put those cables on the ocean to write a guidebook for the world, a black man, Al Richardson, who prevented the laser alarm that showed us when the cables broke and twisted, a black man, Richardson, who gave us the mathematics that enabled us to understand glass for the first time, that we could stretch it from 4-foot rods for 6 miles so that we could create hair-thin strands of glass through which we could send pulses of information coded on pulses of laser light flying at the speed of light, a black man, Northover, who is the man who put these light guide cables for the first time onto the streets in this country in Chicago, a black man, who manufactured the tools, all the tools that made it possible for us to do this, a black man, who is the leading woman at NASA, who has taught us how to deal with sonic boom factor so that we could fly several times the speed of sound by the end of this century without creating sonic boom explosion, a black woman, Dr. Christine Darby. Let us therefore, and I want to close now, let us therefore remember, not only did we not do what they thought we didn't do, we did so many things before the Holocaust. But in spite of the Holocaust, we have not been destroyed. We brought light into the world. It is true Edison pioneered the electric light, but it was a black man, Louis Latimer, who invented the carbon filament that made light cheap, practical, and universal. He was the man who lit New York. He was the man who was flown to London to light London when it was the most powerful city in Europe. We have lit the world, not only in the past, but we have the capacity even now, with this new illumination that our history gives us, to light the world and light our lives again. Thank you. Now I want you to look very closely at these slides. Okay, we'll just spend another 15 minutes in which I will point out certain slides to you. Some of them go beyond the lecture. Could someone operate the machine for me? Could you alter? This is early Britain, when you have both black as well as pink types still surviving in Britain. When the Romans attacked Britain, they found among the white Britons many people who were Ethiopian in caste and color. This is from Royal Crest in Britain. Here is another from Great Britain. Here is a black knight and his fair lady. This is very early Britain. This is from Crete, Malone Crete, where Schliemann and Evans in separate excavations established that the vast majority of the Cretans were black. These people were to have quite an impact on early Greece, even before the Greeks attacked, long before the Greeks attacked the Egyptians and were later affected by the Egyptians. This is a war scene from early Crete. This is about 5,000 years ago. This is from ancient boats in Crete, and Africans were in charge. This is the captain of the guards in ancient Crete. This is a priest from Pylos in ancient Crete. This is a stag hunt in ancient Crete. This is the first evidence we have at Wadi Kumania in the north and Wadi Tushka in the edge of Sudan that Africans had entered the age of cultivated crops thousands of years before any other civilization. This is about 18,000 years old, the first mortar and pestle to grind grain found in Africa. This is from Tarseti, one of the thousands of fragments showing a range of things like the kind of the palace facade in Serex, the boat of the underworld that takes the pharaohs to the underworld, the king sitting in the middle with the strange cap, pharaonic cap, the falcon, indicating the falcon god Horus. This is Osiris. Note now, in spite of the broad nose and the full lips, that he appears to have red skin. He does not have red skin. Red ochre was used in Africa for thousands of years. It's found in southern African paintings when there were no people in the world but blacks. Red ochre is used to indicate vitality, okay, because it's red as blood. Yellow is used on women to indicate fertility. So that this red and yellow, when I was interviewed by the New York Times in February, that was the first question they asked me. If these people are black, how come the men have red skin and the women have yellow skin? And I said, there is no race with red men and yellow women. These are artistic conventions. They ignored it. They never published that. This is his wife. This is Isis. This is the couple, and there in her arms is Horus. This is the beginning of the Holy Trinity. Osiris is the male aspect of God. Isis is the female aspect of God. Horus is the child, forming the Holy Trinity, the first family. This is her again in Egypt. This is her in Spain. Because the Black Madonna, she was the prototype of the Black Madonna. It was to touch a great number of countries across Europe. Even the lunatic Caligula, the Roman lunatic Caligula, had a shrine to Isis. And you would never guess who this is. This is Pope Miltiades. Pope Miltiades, the Black Pope of Rome. This is a painting more than 1,000 years old. It was in St. Peter's Basilica. It's probably now in the Vatican. This man was the Pope of Rome between 311 to 314 AD. He was the Pope at the same time that Constantine, the emperor, was converted to Christianity and stopped the persecution of the Christians and gave back the property of the church back to the Pope. This is one of the 25 saints, black saints of the Roman Catholic Church. This is Saint Maurice, who was patron saint of Germany and Austria. Of course, by the time of Hitler, he was removed from that position. There are several saints, Saint Augustine, an African saint. There are several other saints of the Roman Catholic Church. This is Narmer or Menes, the first pharaoh of Egypt. Now this shows you how the Egyptians saw themselves. I want you to pay close attention to this picture. It has never been published in all those marvelous Smithsonian and other books, National Geographic, who loves photographs. This one shows the Egyptian as he saw himself, black. There comes the Indo-Aryan, pink, with long hair. There comes the Nubian, his brother, and other blacks. Notice the only difference between the Egyptian and the Nubian, here in these realistic colors without artistic convention, is that the Egyptian, the man in the north, has 3 stripes because he's in power, and the Nubian has 2 stripes. And then comes the Semite. Notice their clothing, notice the effort to show everything as natural and distinct. Their clothing is distinct, structure of face is distinct, coloration of skin is distinct, hair is distinct. This is how they saw the world. This is Zoser, who was the pharaoh. You will notice that most of the noses are smashed. He was the pharaoh when the first pyramid of hewn stone, not the Great Pyramid, the first pyramid of hewn stone was built. And it was built by Imhotep. This black man, the multi-genius of the ancient world, but was worshipped by both Europeans and Africans. Europeans know him as Imhotep, Africans know him as Imhotep. He was the Prime Minister of Egypt under Zosa. He was the chief architect who built the world's first pyramid of hewn stone. He was also a doctor. He's known as the father of medicine, not Hippocrates. Hippocrates, by the way, thought that the brain was a gland. Right? Whereas the Egyptians, 1,000 years before Hippocrates, had mapped the cortices of the human brain. Having some problems here getting this operating. This is Egyptian women making perfume about 5,000 years ago. This is Mentuhotep. This is now the Middle Kingdom. Interesting thing about this picture is the joining of the two lands, the white crown of the south and the red crown of the north. This is Kafir or Sheprin, who people believe is the model for the Sphinx. This is another pharaoh of the Middle Kingdom, Amenemhet III. This is Jedefre. Notice always the noses have to be put back together again. Middle Kingdom. This is Sesostris III. He led armies in many places. He conquered 110 cities in Asia. He's also possibly responsible for blacks appearing in Russia. The Russians found, about 40 to 50 years ago, the Russians found a whole village in the Caucasus in the heart of Russia composed purely of black people. They wondered where they came from. We do believe it had something to do with Sesostris, the movement of Sesostris' army. This is Akhenaten, son of a Nubian woman, Tai. He was responsible for the religious reformation. He insisted that there was only one God. Perhaps he did not understand that the reason why several gods were worshipped is that they saw the other gods or semi-deities as netters or attributes of the main god. It's very difficult to talk to God, who is the universe. That is why we choose saints or semi-deities or prophets in order to talk to God. But he made an attack on Amon and insisted it should be replaced by Aton. And some people believe that Moses was born at this time and that he was affected by the teachings of Akhenaten. This is Tut, his brother, and this is the mother of them both, Queen Tai, the Nubian woman. Look at the dishonesty of the New York Times. New York Times knows quite clearly that this is the Nubian woman. There's no dispute about her like Nefertiti. Nefertiti presents us with problems because we found two Nefertitis. We found the Berlin bust, which may or may not be a fake, which has a cast of feature that is not necessarily Africoid. We've also found her in her temple, where her face looks Africoid, but is made to come very close to that of the face of Akhenaten, and some people believe that her face was so structured to suit that of the pharaoh who married her, and that it is quite possible that the foreigner at that time could have entered the royal family. That has nothing to do with the ethnicity of the Egyptians. Napoleon married a mulatto from the Caribbean. That didn't make the French mulattoes. So that is a ridiculous argument. Here is Queen Tai, who at the age of 13 married her pharaoh, who was 51. She gave birth to 3 sons, 2 of whom are very famous: Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, Smenkare. She was worshipped by many people. Everything she did was became a model. Her earrings, her wigs, her clothes, eyebrows, everything became a model for ladies of both lands. When her husband aged, she took power. When her son Tutankhamun was too young to rule, she became queen regent. When Akhenaten became so involved with the religious reformation, she protected the motherland. This is her granddaughter. This is the last of the great sun kings of the ancient world, Taharqa. He, at the age of 21, entered the battlefield of Jerusalem to protect the Jews from the attack of the Syrians. The Jews, as you know, were largely black in Egypt in early times. They became mixed with other peoples. So you have the Semitic type, and today the type that is most numerous among the Jews are the European Jews. But the early Jews are largely black types, and even though there is a charge, most of references in the Bible are anti-Egypt, by the way, because the Jews who wrote the Bible complained of the way they were persecuted by the Egyptians. This was not the persecution of a race, since they're not a race, it was the persecution of a sect. And therefore they harbored certain feelings of resentment against the Egyptians. So that you have lots of negative references about Egypt, but nevertheless they retained a love-hate relationship with Egypt. Jesus, as you know, grew up in a village of Malatia near Heliopolis in Egypt, and we find him first in the Bible when he's a grown boy at the age of 12 among the Egyptian priests. What happened to him in the 18 years before his appearance, his return to Palestine to preach his ministry, we do not know. Some people claim, however, he was completely Egyptian. This we cannot prove. However, Taharqa was called upon by the Jews to protect them, and he entered the battlefield and protected the Jews against the charge of the Asiatics under Sennacherib. The Bible reports that the blacks were victorious in this victory. The Ethiopians were victorious in this victory. Victorious in this encounter with the Syrians. Here is Taharqa again. When I was doing the decade before Columbus, I had difficulty finding a black Taharqa in Britain. The leading British historian who commented on Taharqa, Arkell, said that it is impossible that Taharqa could have been a Negro. He may have only had one drop of Negro in his vein. This is the drop. Now this is an African princess in Egypt. This face is 4,000 years old. It shows you the incredible way nobody since that time have caught up in this. This is our African hair, her skin, her eyebrows, her eyelashes, her teeth, all preserved over 4,000 years. This shows you Maasai, pure African, no mixture. It shows you the problems that occurred when sculptures were made of some women who differed from the basic Africoid type. This is wigs, African wigs, used by Egyptians in early times. We had great difficulty photographing this in the Cairo Museum. This is medical texts of Egypt. This is trepanation, boring a circular hole in the skull to relieve pressure in the brain by the ancient Egyptians. It is an operation that was performed on ex-President Reagan recently when he fell from his horse. Some people believe it should have been performed earlier. Medical instruments, ancient medical instruments of Egypt. Mathematical papyri of Egypt. Wheel chariot. Not wheel chariot, wheel ladder in building the pyramids. Mixture found, that mysterious mixture found which Egyptians used to make the ground icy, smooth as ice, so they could push huge objects across it. Diagram showing how everything they built in the pyramid related to certain knowledge of the cosmos. How their metaphysics and their science fused. This shows you, once again, you see the red and the yellow. Woman's face, clearly Africoid, yet she has yellow skin. It's not yellow skin, it's yellow ochre, symbol of fertility. We wondered how they could go far below the pyramids and yet light it up. How could they see on the ground? There was no electricity. There's no evidence of lamps or candles. And then we found that they had ventilator shafts that were aligned to certain stars and the sun, and that they had metallic mirrors and they could ricochet the light on the ground. First steam engine, 300 BC. First glider, 300 BC. NASA informed me of this. This is the Carthaginian period, where after the victory by Hannibal against Rome, coins were struck showing the African elephants and African types. This is the iron furnace that turned out to be a steel smelting furnace. This is the plotting of Sirius B by the Dogon. This is, that was the astronomical observatory at Namaratunga in Kenya. This is the plotting of Sirius B by the Dogon up to the year 1990. This is the cesarean section observed among the Banyura surgeons. This is from Zimbabwe, largest stone city in the world, 800 years old. Conical tower where you could see from the top of this tower any figure in the valley 30 miles beneath. I'm going to rush over this. These are ships used 1,000 years before Christ by Africans in the Indian Ocean, the Swahili people. This is a boat used 1,000 years before Christ, recreated by Africans in 1969, crossed the Atlantic using current power, showing that they could have done the journey on these currents. This shows the currents, latitudes of the currents, shows how Africa was linked up before the Holocaust. This is the most remarkable map in the world, showing Africans had mapped. They had the correct latitudinal and longitudinal coordinates between the African Atlantic coast and the American Atlantic coast, and they had mapped the Amazon, and they had mapped the Trata River in Colombia for 300 miles. There it is again. This is several blacks were adopted by royal families in Europe. This is the Tsar Peter of Russia adopted this black boy who became a general in the Russian army. He was also put in charge of several Russian towns and villages. He was the tutor to the Crown Prince of Russia. He taught him mathematics. He also, when he was an ambassador, he signed a treaty between Sweden and Russia. He was the grandfather of Pushkin, who is sitting here, the greatest of early Russian poets. This is a result of a liaison between a pope and an African woman. This is Pope Clement VIII, who had an African mistress who gave birth to the Duke of Florence. This is a very remarkable scandal in France, where many of the French kings had African mistresses, and black was considered to be the color of beauty. Hence you have a lot of the nobility and the royal family involved with black women. Shakespeare had an African mistress, Lucy of Clerkenwell. He wrote an ode to her. And this is the famous Black Nun of Moray. Because Louis XIV had an affair with a black woman, his wife, Queen Marie Therese, had an affair with a black man and gave birth to this child. And when she was born, Louis turned to the doctors and said, "How could I give birth to a black child?" The doctor said, "You see that black man in your coat? Now, it is possible that when your wife was pregnant, he looked at her and the child turned black." And King Louis XIV said it must have been a very penetrating look. Anyway, Nabo disappeared and she was sent to a monastery where she died. And last of the pictures we have to end now. This is a captain of the guards among the Moors. This is warriors behind the veil from the Senegal. This is the Prime Minister of Sicily during the Moorish invasion. This is Africans performing circumcision ritual in the heart of Spain during their occupation of Spain. This is an African dignitary arriving in the heart of Spain, road being cleared for him. These are African noblemen playing chess in 12th century Spain. This shows you the interior complexity of African cities. This is from Leo Africanus, whose book was read by Shakespeare and gave him a lot of notions for building Othello. This white man was the richest man in Italy, Gonzaga's family. He married a black woman, whom you see up in the ceiling. That is his daughter, and this is his son. He is Othello. He married a white woman whom he murdered on Christmas Day and left a novel by Cincio. Shakespeare picked up the plot, hence we have Othello. This is Laurence Olivier blackening up for the part. And this is Paul Robeson playing the true part. Thank you.